Okay, so this is an RX 6800 XT, which goes for over $1,200 in this market. Can we play the game at 1440p? Wow. Did we actually do it, guys? Does a $3,000 PC play this game at 60 FPS? Well, looks like about average, although I did see it dip a little bit below there for a second. Yeah. So it's not a locked 60 FPS, but we can get 60 FPS average, it looks like. What sort of settings are we on here? This is Epic settings at 1440p, and I don't have FSR on quite yet, but let's go ahead and actually turn that on to ultra quality and leave the sharpness kind of in the middle there. I know people have different preferences on that. Okay, at 1440p ultra quality, you know, I can see it a little bit in some of the details, especially in motion in the grass, but it doesn't look too bad. And this is now getting me up, you know, into the 70s, 80s. This is a performance that I'd actually be happy to play the game on. So I think that if I do play this game, this might be the way that I go, except that I actually have a 4K screen, so we might need to be testing out 4K in a little bit. Also do 1080p, I think, because, you know, might as well. But all right, it's looking like 1440p Epic settings with FSR on ultra quality can get you some pretty decent performance on a $3,000 computer. This game is just fantastically optimized. All right, let's try out FSR Quality, just for the sake of seeing if we can push it a little bit higher. Quality at 1440p, to me, it just loses too much detail to be worth it if you're already getting good frame rates. So I don't think this is the way that I would go, although this is doing okay. All right, now let's check if it would be a better option to turn down settings. So like, what if we go down to high settings with FSR off? So to do that, we're gonna turn FSR back off. Again, note that with FSR off, we are, you know, in the 60s or so. It actually seems to have stabilized a bit, maybe from, no, when I get here in the brush, it will still drop below 50. So that's why I think we should go ahead and test out high settings. Although in this game, as soon as the draw distance goes down, it goes from being incredibly beautiful to having tons and tons of pop-in. This is gonna require a restart, so I'll do that and pop right back in. All right, we've loaded in at the high settings. You can definitely tell the grass doesn't extend as far into the distance, making the world, and like, you can see a lot more popping in of the plants and things as you move. I personally find this a little bit distracting, so I really do prefer the Epic settings, although you can see that it does seem like we can now get actually above 60 FPS gameplay, and this certainly feels good and doesn't require FSR to get you there. Although speaking of FSR, let's go ahead and test out what happens if we add FSR onto these. So as you can see, we were just here at the high preset, and we can go FSR to ultra quality. All right, with that enabled, and now we seem to be getting some very solid frame rate. Although again, at 1440p, especially in games with grass like this, I just feel like with FSR on in motion, it breaks up enough that on this GPU at least, I probably wouldn't use FSR at 1440p, just because I think we were able to get good enough frame rates without it that I don't personally like that visual trade-off, although a lot of other people might find it worth it. We'll go ahead and test out medium settings, which again will require a restart. Okay, well here we are at medium settings, and look at all this weird shimmery stuff going on with the shadows and the leaves. I've seen this a few other times I've loaded into this game, and what seems to have fixed it is turning the FSR on, where it then stabilizes. and then turning the FSR back off. Now, I'm not sure if that's doing something to the other settings. Oh, look, that turned the anti-aliasing up to epic. So that's what it is. I think it's just when your anti-aliasing goes down to medium or low, that's just what the game looks like. Okay, so I've finally sorted it out. And I guess turning on FSR fixes the anti-aliasing. So here we are at medium, and the game looks terrible without the anti-aliasing. I guess I'll leave it off. I don't think this is a bug. I think this is actually what it looks like without the anti-aliasing past medium. Interesting. We can also see that we're starting to see the draw distances at medium extremely low. So hey, can we run the game at, you know, pretty high frame rates? Well, sorta. We're in the 80s here. But at what cost? When people argue in my comment section on some of my other videos about this it's not that the game's unoptimized. Guys, an optimized game might be demanding on the high settings, but it should scale down well. You should be able to turn down settings and have a reasonable compromise to your visuals, not get this weird, shimmering, disgusting mess with terrible draw distances that just have distracting shadows like draw as you move. And like the grass, this is just not a good balance. And the performance still isn't even that high, considering we're on a extremely high-end GPU, and this is not even at 4K. Anyway, we could do medium settings with FSR, which, notice, it does seem to turn the anti-aliasing, off. So in other words, it's actually, I think, using a higher anti-aliasing setting. And then that goes ahead and stabilizes all those weird shadows and things, which probably also explains why the performance isn't even that much higher, because actually, while it turns on FSR, it's then turning up the anti-aliasing a bit. Anyway, there we go. I don't think I'm going to bother going down to low settings on this GPU, because we can already tell that medium's not even worth it. Epic or high are the only ones that seem to make sense here, and then possibly with FSR. Let's go ahead and try this game out with some ray tracing. I'll have to switch to DX12 mode in order to do that, which will be another restart. All right, well, we now have ray tracing enabled, and we're in DX12 mode on the Epic settings. Let me go ahead and show you. Now, this is not the full ray tracing yet. I don't have the global illumination on. So, and no FSR yet. So this is RTX enabled. Now, I haven't looked into exactly what ray tracing that enables. I'm wondering if it's just like softer shadows or something like that from the sun. I'm not really sure. We can tell our frame rate is certainly, ooh, when I spun around there, we got a bit of a spike, but seems to have smoothed out a bit now. DX12 mode, I think will have a lot of frame pacing issues. That's common in a lot of Unreal Engine games, especially when you're first loading into the game. And as you play the game over time, it tends to get better. I think it's like caching textures or I don't know if textures is the right thing for what it's caching, but assets. It's a common Unreal Engine issue, but look at that. We're getting these big spikes. This is one reason why I was doing all the other testing in DX11 mode. It seemed to run a lot smoother. Okay, so there it is with the ray tracing on, and actually this is a playable experience despite not being at 60 FPS, and those stutters will probably, like I said, get better throughout the game, and it's kind of a DX12 issue. Let's try turning on global illumination, though. I have a feeling this is going to be a bit brutal. Okay, global illumination. We hit the I don't want good frame rate button. And you know what? This is actually kind of playable. Like, personally, I'd prefer to just turn off ray tracing and have better frame rates, but that's generally my thought on ray tracing. But hey, this actually seems pretty playable. You certainly could use these settings. Now let's go ahead and see if FSR is able to balance it out a bit. So FSR Ultra Quality, which if I'm going for good visuals at 1440p, I'm not going to go any more aggressive than that. Can this get us close to 60 FPS with all the ray tracing turned on? Man, I still don't like the slight loss of sharpness and detail with that FSR enabled, but it is getting us fairly close to a 60 FPS experience here, except for these stutters we're getting. Again, that's more of a DX12 thing, I believe. Like I said, I think would get better over time. Okay. So I guess it's going to be kind of up to you if playing on a stuttery DX12 and using FSR is worth getting the ray tracing, which, to be honest here, I'd be hard-pressed to actually point out it looking so much better. Let's go ahead and turn ray tracing off and FSR off. Okay, I feel like with the ray tracing on, like there was a lot more realistic shadowing going on with things. So I mean, it was doing something. It's not that it wasn't doing anything, but I guess my argument is, you know, was it doing enough to be worth the frame rate hit? But I'll leave that up to you guys. It certainly was usable, especially if you're willing to turn on FSR. Although, like I said, for me, there's a bit too much loss of detail at 1440p. I usually save it for 4K myself. Speaking of 4K, let's go ahead and load this game into 4K. Okay, well, we've loaded in at 4K, and this is at Epic settings. I don't think I have the FSR on. Let's just double check. So 4K, Epic preset, FSR is off. I'm on DX11 again with the ray tracing off. I find the frame rate a lot smoother, more stable. And again, I will hand it to this game. At the maximum settings, and now especially at 4K, the game, the scenery really is gorgeous, especially when that draw distance goes far enough out that I'm not extremely distracted by tons of pop-in. Although I will say, I wish the draw distance was even further, because you can see as we move here that we do still get things drawing in a fairly noticeable way. It's just a lot better than at the lower settings. Now, can this GPU do it? Again, we're not using any kind of FSR yet or anything, and it's looking like you absolutely could lock into 30 FPS here. I think if that was this does seem like a fairly slow-paced game, and a lot of it's about the immersive experience, so I would possibly argue that this is the type of game where frame capping to 30 to keep it really steady, and then you know, cranking up all the settings might be, you know, you might argue that that's a thing you could do. It does feel, at least in DX11 mode, fairly consistent in terms of frame rate, which feels a lot better than like when it bounces around all the time. Okay, this is the kind of thing that FSR is made for, though. It's really for trying to run at like 4K and make that easier to handle. So let's try Ultra Quality. Let's see what happens. Okay, at 4K, I've got to say it's very difficult to tell that the FSR is on, except let's take a look at the foliage and especially in motion. That's my concern. That looks a little bit shimmery to me. I'm going to try turning FSR off again to compare. Try to decide if it would be worth it. You know what? It's shimmery even with FSR off, to be honest. So that's not really that bad at all. Now let's compare the frame rate again here. We're sitting there at like 35 FPS. And with the Ultra Quality on here, we're up to 50 in the same scene. So that is a huge, huge performance boost. And at 4K, that's where I feel like it's almost an imperceptible difference. So I would absolutely recommend FSR if you're trying to run this game at 4K. Of course, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, try out DLSS. It usually does as good or better of a job, although sometimes you get some ghosting issues that you don't get with FSR, so might still be worth comparing the two. Yeah, I'd actually say that this is pretty playable, and since I'm on a 4K screen, if I do continue playing this game, I think this is the settings I'm going to use. I'm going to go Epic 4K with Ultra Quality, and on a slow-paced game like this, and on a variable refresh rate screen to help kind of smooth it out a bit, I think I'm probably okay with this. Although let's try out Quality, because again, at 4K, sometimes this still looks pretty good. Okay, almost hitting 60 FPS now. The loss of detail is slightly more noticeable. Although again, at 4K, it still looks very detailed. I see it more than you guys probably do because I'm on a 48-inch screen. If you're not sitting close to a 48-inch screen, you probably wouldn't notice as much of that. So on a smaller 4K screen, this probably still looks really good. And we are hitting, you know, it's not a perfect locked 60 FPS, but pretty close to it. Although with a lot of shadows and foliage, it looks like we're dropping into the 40s still. Okay. Just for the sake of, you know, completion, let's go ahead and test out FSR on the balanced setting, which at 4K, you know, it's almost like what's the point of having a 4K screen if you're gonna run it like this, because it does start to look a lot more smeared in the details. Frame rates are a lot more consistently above 60 now, which is nice. Let's see how it does in this more shadowy foliage. That was a really hard scene. Looks like at least now we are staying, oh, I was gonna say staying above 60, but we're actually not. Okay, well, let's try out the high settings at 4K and compare that to how we were doing here on the Epic settings. Is it gonna be enough of a performance increase to be worth it? Let's find out after a restart. Okay, 4K high settings. High settings still look pretty good. It's medium where I feel like you're really starting to lose out on too much of the draw distance. High, you know, you can see some pop in, it's a little distracting, but still pretty reasonable, and the shadows and lighting still look pretty good. So this would certainly be something you could consider. This spot is really hard to run. We're dropping into the 30s here, but in the, you know, not quite so shadowy spots with this dense of foliage, we're up into the 40s. Let's go ahead and check out what happens if we use some FSR on this thing. So the FSR Ultra Quality looks fantastic at 4K. This is totally usable. Ooh, and is this the magic we needed to kind of be around 60 FPS at 4K? Because playing at high instead of Epic, if it just means FSR Ultra Quality can keep us around 60 FPS most of the time, this might actually be the way I'd go. Okay, so we definitely still dip in these really shadowy and dense foliage scenes, but now we're dipping to around 50 instead of dipping down into the 30s, you know? Okay, I've got to say this might be the way to go. If you're playing at 4K on a 6800 XT, FSR Ultra Quality at high settings is looking and performing acceptably. Let's go ahead and kick FSR onto quality before we finish up our 4K testing. I think I want to at least do a quick 1080p run as well, just at like Epic settings, just see how the card does at 1080p, because there's definitely people who play some single player games, but they're still running at 1080p because they're mostly focused on esports. You know, you might like if you're like 360 hertz 1080p esports monitor with your 6800 XT, but you know, you might pop into a survival game every now and then, so. Looks like we're staying close to 60 FPS even in these dense foliage if we're willing to go FSR Quality on the high settings. So, hey, 4K on this game is definitely doable with FSR on a $3,000 computer. Let's test out some 1080p. Okay, so if you're the kind of person who has a 6800 XT but plays at 1080p, what kind of performance will you get? Well, honestly, I was hoping for even better than this, but at least I can say you get a pretty decent frame rate at 1080p. And these are the Epic settings, and I'm not using FSR or anything. So yeah, Epic settings, 1080p, no FSR. And it looks like we're in the 80s to 90s. I wonder how we do in this shadowy foliage. Ooh, we drop into the mid 60s. Can we stay above 60 FPS at 1080p? Looks like we can. Okay, So the last thing I want to test out at 1080p is if I switch over to DX12 and try some ray tracing, see if that's possible at 1080p. Okay, let's go ahead and step out into the world with all the settings turned on. Just to be clear, let's double check. We're at 1080p. We are on all Epic settings, and I've turned RTX on, including the global illumination. I'm curious if we can stay above 60 FPS without needing FSR, since we're already playing at 1080p. And you know what? It's looking like it will do the job. Although once again, running this kind of a GPU, ooh, we dipped heavily right there. But again, the DX12 just seems to be really stuttery. Hey, looks like my kids are ready for lunch, so I'm gonna end the video right here. And I hope you guys have an excellent day.